Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you. And welcome to the last session of our Scholars Symposium. Last but certainly not least, I am Isis Arabe, Artistic Director of the March on Washington Film Festival, and this is a new addition to our festival lineup, having these series of talks during the day. We're experimenting on expanding our festival footprint to include more issues during the day as well as the evening work that we do. So I hope that you will continue to consult our schedule. We're halfway through our week and there are still many more events for you to attend. I'm especially excited about this one because this gentleman is a particular friend of the festival. Khalil Gibran Muhammad is a professor of history, race, and public policy at Harvard Kennedy School and the Suzanne Young Murray Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies. He is the former director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, a division of the New York Public Library, and the world's leading library and archive of global Black history, and is in Harlem, which is my hometown, and we all miss him tremendously. Before leading the Schomburg Center, Khalil was an associate professor at Indiana University. His scholarship and teaching examines the broad intersections of race, democracy, inequality, and criminal justice in modern U.S. history. Much of his work has been featured in a number of national print and broadcast media outlets, including the New York Times, the New Yorker, Washington Post, National Public Radio, Moyers and Company, MSNBC, and C-SPAN. He has appeared in a number of feature-length documentaries, including Slavery by Another Name in 2012 and the Oscar-nominated 13th in 2016. A native of Chicago's South Side, Khalil graduated from the University of Pennsylvania with a BA in economics in 1993, and then joined Deloitte and Touche as a staff accountant until entering graduate school. He earned his PhD in U.S. history from Rutgers University. And those of us in the Black conscious community, as we call it, know him by another source. He is the son of renowned photographer Osier Muhammad and the great-grandson of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, founder of the Nation of Islam. We are so excited to present Dr. Khalil Muhammad.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all of the organizers and the staff and all the very busy people working behind the scenes to make this festival a success, and certainly our accommodations here today. I'm always grateful for that hard work. Having run the Schomburg Center, I have tremendous respect and appreciation for all the hands that help make things work well. So thank you to the festival organizers and staff. So I have titled today's talk, which is mostly a written talk. I may stray from the text here and there, The White Problem and the Unfinished Work of the Civil Rights Movement, because I'm having an ongoing dialogue with myself about what it is that I can say new about this great American experiment. Because it seems to me that part of the spirit of the festival is to both celebrate, commemorate, and take stock of what the movement did and did not do. But it seems to me part of the story here is not just about the story of the last 50 years. It's the story of the last 350 years, or 400 years if we count Jamestown, which we will be celebrating or commemorating for the landing of the first Africans in this country in 2019. So this talk is really about putting us in a position to think about the relationship of what we've asked and what we've gotten in return. And so I'm going to leave that deliberately ambiguous just to get us started. Now, in 1969, many of us recall, and those of us who've studied this past who were not here for it, recall that one of the greatest moments of potential for a multiracial democracy different than the one that we've actually witnessed the last 50 years was being led by a young African-American man named Fred Hampton in Chicago. had taken, in some ways, the unfinished work of the civil rights movement seriously in those very early days and began to build, person by person, community by community, a way of challenging the actual twin evils and the intersections of capitalism and racism. And that involved Chicanos, Puerto Ricans. It involved poor white people. It involved young people coming together in ways that were both rooted in a domestic story here in this country, but also globally. And in some ways, we've been playing catch-up ever since, because we know what happened to Fred Hampton, and we know that state violence, a form of explicit repression, ensued in this country, of which we have been living in the shadow of for the past 50 years. So what might the last 50 years have looked like if Fred Hampton had not been assassinated in 1969? What might the last 50 years have looked like if a vision of police accountability, of which that movement 50 years ago was committed to after the civil rights movement, had been allowed to flourish rather than to be defined as a national security threat? I want to address this history, and I want you to think about it in light of a joke that is circulating on Facebook. And so I'm not going to take credit for it. I think a Russian bot is responsible for this joke. And here it is. Essentially, the joke is that there's a sinking cruise ship, and this cruise ship is obviously a metaphor for our democracy. And on this ship, you've got passengers who are literally screaming for their lives. They all look to the captain to do something, and in an act of desperation, the captain turns to a black woman who works on this cruise ship. She's an employee. She's part of the janitorial staff. Her job is to clean the bathrooms, to bus the tables, to make sure that the halls and corridors are clean. So as this sinking cruise ship begins to lean to one side, the captain calls out to her, "You there, black woman, you pray for us." You can see where this is going. So she says to herself, "Lord, when I came to work today, the sign over the door said, 'Whites only.' When I went to clean the tables after these folks ate, the sign said, 'Whites only.' When I cleaned the bathroom, the sign said, 'Whites only.' So Lord, as you take this ship, I pray that you take whites only." Now, you can already begin to hear the echo or the relationship between this white problem and our democracy vis-a-vis what the civil rights movement attempted to achieve in this country. Because in many ways, this joke gestures to the absolute fundamental truth of the contributions of black people to making the very democracy that so many of us find teetering on the edge of destruction in this moment. But this is a story that too often plays second fiddle to the story of American exceptionalism. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But before I do that, I want to quote someone who said this better than I have said, because he lived in the moment when he could see the road forward in ways that we are now trying to look back. You might recall that Lerone Bennett, who passed just this past year, the longtime editor and contributor of Johnson Publications, namely Ebony and Jet magazines, wrote a book that for most of us probably either never read or have long since forgotten. It was a book that was a collection of commissioned essays for the August 1965 issue of Ebony magazine. Does anyone recall the name of that special edition that became a book? No. The White Problem in America. And in the opening of that book, so you have to catch this, published in August of 1965. In other words, this was at the end of the two major civil rights victories, public accommodations, and the Voting Rights Act. think about the audacity to imagine that the next step forward in making real the possibilities of those legislative changes was for white people to change their behavior. So he says in the opening pages of this, what became a volume, there is no Negro problem in America. The problem of race in America, insofar as that problem is related to packets of melanin in men's skins, is a white problem. It was a stroke of genius, really, for white Americans to give Negro Americans the name of their problem, thereby focusing attention on symptoms, the Negro and the Negro community, instead of causes, the white man and the white community. So in putting together both this prescription in 1965 and the actual activist work of Fred Hampton on the eve of his demise in 1969, I want us to think about what it is that we have gotten wrong in light of these last 50 years. So thinking about the cruise ship in our democracy, I want to shout out a political scientist named Michael Dawson. He's at the University of Chicago and has led the Center for Race and Ethnicity for many years. On the eve of President Obama's 2012 re-election, Michael Dawson had this to say. He said, "Today there is a disconnect between black organizing and other mobilizations on behalf of labor, suffrage, and radical economic reform. Even worse," he continued, "the black civil society that in the past supported flourishing black activism is today weaker than it was for most of the 20th century. And here's the key. Without a mobilized black politics, American democracy is even more vulnerable to internal attacks by those who have been openly suspicious of mass democratic movements for decades." Think about this for a moment. Think about what Fred Hampton might have been. Think about that cruise ship of American democracy from that moment to ours, and the prediction of Michael Dawson in 2012, 4 years before Donald Trump won a Republican primary and became our president. You see, there's something about this American life that we keep forgetting. That we keep forgetting that the very people who helped make this country into a multiracial democracy, away from a whites-only slave republic, keep being forgotten in the great narratives of what makes America, quote-unquote, great. I want to take stock of how it is that we have forgotten this legacy, and in fact, if Dawson is right, weakened the very basis upon which our cruise ship has managed to stay afloat for as long as it has. So I want to focus on 3 things in this way. I want to talk about an era that I see since the 1960s, since the Civil Rights Movement, as an era of black firsts, of black folk who took the possibilities and the promises of the Civil Rights era into new positions of leadership, positions of government, positions of finance, and in the private sector, as well as in the nonprofit sector. I want to talk about a strategy after this particular strategy and others after the Civil Rights Movement. We, of course, know that Dr. King died on the eve of a Poor People's March, but what we often forget is that the legacy of the Poor People's March wasn't just that Coretta Scott King went on to lead that march of roughly 50,000 in attendance, of which we heard a little bit about today, but that Richard Nixon engaged in a campaign of black capitalism in the late 1960s as his policy response to the inequitable distribution of black economic opportunity. In other words, if the Poor People's March was a vision that Dr. King died fighting for, which is about redistributing opportunity and resources, it's not clear to me that black capitalism was equipped to do that. I also want to talk a little bit about the gospel of personal responsibility, because it seems to me that part of what has weakened our black civil society has precisely been the fact that we've told black people that they have not made meaningful contributions to American democracy, that by dint of their personal failings, they've in fact threatened the nation's ability to move forward, that they've lived under, that they have in fact are in fault and to blame for the kinds of intergenerational poverty that they've lived under, and if only they had magically woken up every day and worked a little bit harder, the world would not be an unequal place, and most certainly racism would not exist. That their disadvantage was perfectly commensurate with their bad behavior. That has in part been the gospel of personal responsibility. I'm really fond of this expression by our former First Lady, Michelle Obama, when she said, "When they go low, we go high." Of course, you remember it, and I love that expression. Who doesn't? And I love them, but I worry. And I worry that if we are to learn anything about the past, let's say, for example, the Reconstruction period, rise and fall of black political leadership, and what has been going on over the last 50 years about our capacity to protect American democracy from its resurgent white nationalist or white supremacist backlashes, or the kind of insidious, everyday, what I call low-grade anti-blackness and anti-brownness that sort of sits just beneath the surface at all times, I worry that President Obama's policy agenda was inadequate and will be inadequate to the challenges we face going forward. In other words, the third thing I want to talk about is actually the histories that we aren't talking about. Brian Stevenson refers to this as the racial narrative, that essentially we won the Civil War, but we lost the battle over the racial narrative about the meaning of that war, the meaning of our history, of who we are. If we go back in the wake of the Trump election to what we could call neoliberal business as usual, we will remain in a bad way. Let me paint a picture that may be obvious to some, but often goes underappreciated in our daily walk. When I think about neoliberalism, I think about a market response to inequality. But we have another example that we don't really pay as much attention to because it's been under attack for precisely the same half-century that I'm describing. The New Deal, to be specific, brought with it not just the greatest period of equality in American history. This is, in fact, true. But it brought with it the highest marginal tax rates and averaged about 75% at the highest tax bracket. The New Deal, with those high taxes, brought a measure of economic equality and subsidized an infrastructure that would ultimately underwrite the actual civil rights movement. Now, make no mistake about it, the New Deal did not achieve racial justice. But if we're fighting on two fronts, oftentimes intersecting on those two fronts, that is, on the economics and the racism, we've been losing on both. We have today, as a result, from the radical shift that gave us resurgent Republican response to the New Deal, many of the leadership, of the same leadership, have said that their single purpose is to destroy big government as a result. We now have unprecedented wealth in this country. That unprecedented wealth takes the form also of unprecedented big philanthropy. So that philanthropy, as Dr. King taught us, is itself a symptom of the problem. Dr. King didn't want, for example, more philanthropists to support the civil rights movement. He wanted policies that would minimize the need for philanthropy in the first place. If we want to actually celebrate the truth teller and the social justice warrior that he was, then we have to be mindful that the more we go expecting a philanthropist, the further away from the dream that he had for a vision of economic justice in this country upon which he died and so many others. So we've moved in the opposite direction. There will be more money given away through philanthropy than at any time in U.S. history, way beyond what Andrew Carnegie, John Rockefeller, or Julius Rosenwald gave away, which practically means that there will be more power in the hands of single individuals or the philanthropic elites to define exactly what is just and what is good in our society. Now, you may be thinking, what does this have to do with anything? Well, let me give you an example. I have a couple of older, rich white guy who I spend some time with. They're always curious what my opinion is about this or about that. They want an update. They're confused about what has gone on in the world. They've spent the last 4 or 5 decades supporting things and figured that they've fought the good fight and would expect to see things much further down the road than they actually are, if not having gone backwards. And I mention this because I learn a lot in this intergenerational dialogue, which is also very much a class conversation about where they sit in the world and where I sit. So they use me as a sounding board. And occasionally I get questions from people like this in other circles of New York City where I have spent a fair amount of time fundraising. And someone will ask me something like this. They'll say, you know, I'm curious, was Malcolm X a hero of yours? Now, these moments always strike me as windows into the question, or the moments of these questions always strike me as windows into a kind of ideological litmus test. What they really want to know is, you know, what kind of black are you? Another one asked me once, was Angela Davis a criminal? To which, of course, I had to respond emphatically, no. In fact, she was a freedom fighter. That her vision of the end of state violence 40 years ago is precisely the conversation that we're supposed to be having today in the realm of policing or in incarceration. I say this because it's precisely the fact of this history that continues to shape the kinds of decisions people make about who to trust with other people's money. In other words, how we remember these pasts are also determining who gets to shape the future, and how that money moves into the kinds of grassroots or nonprofit or arts work that happens in the world, all of which runs through philanthropy. In other words, that they think about a just society, they think about a just society that doesn't include Angela Davis or Malcolm X. I've also heard in some of these conversations with donors and others that the question of inequality, the kind of work that is happening all over the place, and certainly many, many pockets of DC and in New York and Boston, the kind of anti-poverty work, or what we might generally describe as the kind of nonprofit work that is meant to close the kinds of racial disparities that so plague these communities. So one of the most successful Fortune 500 former CEOs, whose name will go unmentioned here, a black first himself, one of those folks who moved into positions of leadership after the civil rights movement and took the helm of a major corporation, actually a few major corporations. When asked by one of my wealthy white male friends what to make of all this nonprofit work focused on racial disparity gaps, particularly for young black men, he was asked this because this person, this white male, wanted to know, my donor friend, whether he should continue to support the kind of work he's been doing for a long time. And so this black first said to him in response, look, I grew up in the projects, I worked hard, I was ambitious, that's what they need to do. Now, again, this is an anecdote, but the point here is that most of us don't get to have these conversations with those who are in a position to have what we call hyper-agency. Their individual decision-making shapes many more lives than what most people get to do. And so here we have a black first, and here we have a white philanthropist, and at the end of the day, the problem of economic inequality for black people or poor people in general is personal responsibility. So he turns to me and he says, well, what do you think? And I say, well, does that apply to the millions of white people who are killing themselves in rural and exurban America, who are self-medicating with alcohol and heroin and opioids because they can't see their way forward, or in all the talk from Arlie Hochschild or the reboot of the Roseanne show, which is no longer rebooted, although they're going to come up with another version, that this notion that somehow working class white Americans are victims of a larger system that is unfairly mistreating them, that somehow their opportunity structures have changed because their children can no longer expect to do better than their parents have done, that they don't get to somehow pass on their economic privileges rooted to the New Deal, of which they themselves have not earned, but simply have been given as entitlements. That's the intersection of that gospel of personal responsibility from the mouth of a Black first, of someone whose own life intersected with Black capitalism as a way of satisfying the need for what I will call symbolic inclusion. That we just want Black people at the table of domination. We're not interested in actually changing the place settings. Now, there is this heroic history of civil rights that we often remember and that we celebrate annually during Black History Month. And usually the story starts with what happened in the wake of the March on Washington movement, which begins in 1940 in Chicago, led by Philip Randolph and many others who ultimately take their case through Eleanor Roosevelt to FDR for the purpose of saying, we want access to defense industries work. We are new migrants in these big cities. We want jobs. We're going to help build the arsenal for democracy that will fight ultimately in World War II. And ultimately what comes out of that is an executive order to desegregate defense industries. Also, the EEOC has its origins in this early moment, and a number of blue ribbon civil rights commissions flow from this early moment of activism. So this familiar beginning story often is one that fast forwards very quickly, unlike here at the March on Washington Film Festival, where we actually dig into the details. So present company excluded. In the rest of this arc of history, we move very quickly from the impact of World War II to the returning GIs and their efforts to bring the double victory, a victory against fascism abroad and racism at home, into the Southern Civil Rights Movement. And things move from the bus boycott to the Little Rock episode, which we've learned much more about today from Mr. Green, to the Greensboro sit-ins, and all this, of course, is familiar to you. For the most part, that's the way we've treated this past outside of this context. In the national story, we've treated this mostly as soundbite history, minimizing the complexity, the uncertainty, and the indeterminacy of what so many everyday Black women, men, and children fought to achieve. And I heard a question earlier from a young man, my age, 40-something, who's not here any longer. He said he wanted to know the actual tactics. He wanted to get inside the head of those activists who were uncertain about what was next, in a way to help model for the kinds of questions and uncertainty that people have today. Imagine what our national mythology has done with this history, only ultimately to say that the movement, that the civil rights movement was another verse in the song of American exceptionalism, that a nation of bigots and bystanders have for 50 years congratulated itself for becoming a what? A, quote, more perfect union. As if the politicians all woke up one day to, quote, let freedom ring, just like the enslaved sold themselves to freedom, setting in motion a movement against slavery and its eventual demise. You might recall the great debate in 2008 in the midst of the Democratic primary between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, when all of a sudden we had to decide whether Lyndon Baines Johnson deserved more credit for the civil rights victories or Martin Luther King. I don't think there'd be much a debate in this context, but there certainly was one nationally. So when I think about the actual history, I think about those torchbearers of democracy, those returning GIs and the women who put themselves on the line in their own communities to be the infrastructure of the civil rights movement. They made real multiracial democracy. They made it possible, stretching back to the Reconstruction era, for the 14th Amendment in the Reconstruction years, to have equal protection under the law and due process, and ultimately birthright citizenship, the basis upon which the children of Muslim immigrants and Mexicans can be here in this country today. The only Western nation in the world that has such a protection. You see, if we only have soundbite history, then we can't actually appreciate the very infrastructure the ballast of this cruise ship of our democracy when it's under attack, because we can't see that it's always been under attack. That's what the ballast is for. It's there to hold the ship steady. But you don't see it, you just enjoy everything that is above the line. I was down in Alabama recently for the opening of the National Peace Memorial, and Michelle Alexander was speaking from the stage. She said something that I want to share with you because I thought it is an incredibly wise and important rejoinder to what most of us have been saying. She said from the stage, Trump is the resistance. And she said, let me repeat, Trump is the resistance because the president is resisting the work of all of those who have tried to make this country live up to its best ideals and practices, and who has stood in as the scapegoats for what is wrong in America. Black Lives Matter and immigrants. It's precisely because we haven't been committed to holding that legacy that we find ourselves in a weakened state to deal with Trump's resistance. We haven't been teaching our children these stories, for the most part. The Southern Poverty Law Center now has been focusing on what kind of history is being taught in our nation's classrooms. And just by way of one example, in 2011, they looked at every state in the union to see how much civil rights history do we actually teach. What they found was that most don't teach any. 16 states had no requirements for teaching civil rights history. None, nada, zilch. And 19 may as well have not taught anything more than that Rosa Set and Martin Walt. When they asked in a poll of 12,000 high school seniors in this report, what is the meaning of Brown versus Board of Education and why is it important, two-part question, they found that only 2% of 12,000 high school seniors could answer both parts of the question correctly. We are also in the midst of an explosion of new scholarship around racial capitalism through the history of the transatlantic slave trade, and tying the actual institution of slavery to the emergence and development of capitalism. In other words, everything that we take for granted in modern finance in terms of securitized debt, in terms of actually insuring property as a way of then making insurance an investment, which is what gave the basis of wealth in our financial capital through finance. In other words, that slavery created the necessity for the kinds of lending of money and the securing of debt that we now know to be high finance in this nation. The relationship of slavery to capitalism is that they grew up together. That slavery was, of course, not an aberration. Or, as Ta-Nehisi Coates says, it wasn't a bump on the road, it was the road. They also did a scan, Southern Poverty Law Center recently, and a report called Teaching Hard History. This report came out just this year, and it found that amongst another sample of high school seniors, going back to 2016 when they conducted the study, to the question of what caused the Civil War, only 8% could give the correct answer. Why should we be surprised if America has always been perfect? If a country born in slavery and another 100 years of Jim Crow and mass incarceration soon followed has always been perfect, why should we want to know the history of enslaved people in this country, or their resistance, or their efforts, successful though they have been, to make real democracy in America, or to take a real account of what happened in the civil rights movement, or that for Dr. King, who late in his life felt that the movement was not going to achieve its purpose, that when he came to the North and landed in Chicago, my hometown, old man Richard Daley put up so much resistance that he later quipped that Chicago demonstrated some of the worst racism that he had seen at any time in his organizing career. I think taking stock of all this, we put a little bit too much faith in this American exceptionalism. And it often manifests itself in these stories of Black First. of this symbolic inclusion, of the simple fact that a black person could, in fact, achieve something meant that there was nothing wrong in the system itself. Here's one bit of wisdom I think we should take from this moment. The 50-year-old rules for racial advancement, in my opinion, are now obsolete. There's no racial barrier left to break. There's no office in the land to which an African American can ascend, from mayor to attorney general to the presidency, that will serve as a magical platform for saving black people and our nation from its racist past. We cannot engineer a more equitable nation simply by dressing up institutions in more shades of brown. Instead, we must confront structural racism and the values of our institutions. Again, lesson from the last 50 years. We also must recognize that capitalism on its own terms will not save us either. None of us. That the trade-offs for innovation, the trade-offs for wealth accumulation, are the same trade-offs that made this nation a very rich country 250 years ago. Those trade-offs mean that some lives are unworthy of investment, of dignity. That when the greatest recession since the Great Depression found banks engaging in predatory lending practices back in 2008, and the NAACP sued those banks, the actual settlements, now you have to hear me carefully, according to the former President Cornell Brooks, was not redistribution of the wealth stolen by the banks of those who lost their homes, but in fact, financial literacy training. You're not listening to me. The response orchestrated by the Department of Justice and the Treasury to the settlements for banks found guilty of predatory lending practices was not a guarantee of issuing new loans on fair terms, but in fact, financial literacy training. Because in a world of capitalism, it's every woman and man for herself and himself, and therefore, what we're going to do is pay for your training so that you can compete with us. So think about this, folks. Unregulated finance took advantage of people who were benefiting from government programs to increase the greatest asset that you can have in this economy, were then subject to usurious lending rates and deceitful lending practices, and the solution to their penitence was to give money to encourage black and brown people in general to be smarter when the next mortgage broker calls them and says, "I've got a great deal for you." That's where we are right now. That's what neoliberalism has produced. In an age beginning in the 1980s with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, government became a Trojan horse for communism. The less, the better. It was already a Trojan horse for a communist takeover in the civil rights era in the 1950s and 60s. It only moved into a new and more effective stage. This social Darwinism, revisited only this time with black first in part expressing it, gave the veneer of legitimacy it had never had. The generation of black mayors and police chiefs leading increasingly to new black cities were now proof that civil rights had been achieved. And then look at what happened. Black failure around every corner of the housing projects, low-performing schools, or police stations overflowing with bad kids. This was the story that was being told about the failure of black people to govern their own affairs. This was the trade-off for the access of now black people standing in front of the cameras or the dais when something terrible has gone wrong in a city. I don't know about you, but in the wake of the Starbucks controversy, when two black men were arrested for waiting for a white man to have a cup of coffee over a meeting, they were arrested by 6 of Philadelphia's finest, which included at least 2 black men by my visual accounting. Except that the black police chief, Richard Ross, the police commissioner, said that his men were doing nothing wrong. Something is terribly wrong with this picture. And it is not an accident that we will continue to see black police chiefs show up in these very communities where white people are weaponizing fear to control white spaces. What I say is I'm not concerned about who's in charge based on the color of their skin. I'm concerned about what they see when they see black and brown people and poor people in this country. That, to me, is the work that we have to do going forward. We cannot pretend that our individual success will change these structures that fundamentally reproduce poverty, policies, and ideologies that ensure that all of us will work as hard as we are working now, but may live a life well-led and wonder if we, in fact, made a difference. In other words, we don't want to be sitting here 20 years from now wondering if, in fact, the last 20 years have amounted to much. That's a depressing thought. We have to lead the effort to change the narrative. It's not just about the work that we do and all of the amazing capacities that everyone in this struggle brings to the job. We have to change the narrative about what this country is capable of, both its beauty and its terrible ugliness. How can we claim to be fearless in the wake of scientific research where we leave no stone unturned in the search for every kind of cure, for example, in medical sciences, for cancer, for example, and yet we recoil from facing the facts of our own past? We refuse to teach our children what has happened, and of course those children come back and reproduce the same kinds of challenges. Now, here things might get a little uncomfortable. Electing Democrats, even progressive ones, won't fix this either. We have veered so far off course into the land of branded justice that everything in the Democratic Party politics structure has a kind of gilded quality to it. It looks good, it sounds good, it might even feel like the real McCoy, but often it isn't and hasn't been for a long time. If we're not willing to come to terms with that, then the worry I think we should have is that we'll have a wonderful, well-spoken 2020 presidential candidate who will say all of the right things. I'm not convinced, unless we are willing to do the work of holding them accountable, that they will do the right thing. That's another choice that we have in front of us. My greatest worry in the Trump era, aside from what's happening in every executive branch of the government and judicial appointments, aside from this nightmare, my greatest worry is that we will elect someone in 2020 whose bar for racial justice, for social justice, for immigrant rights, for challenging the actual fundamentals of our capitalist society that has bequeathed money, monopoly power in every sphere of influence and industry, dark money in politics, big money in philanthropy, that bar will be too low. What if the bar is so low that our highest aspirations will simply be to reboot what we had with President Obama? That most certainly is better than what we have now. But you have to remember and not forget that the Black Lives Matter movement started with President Obama. The problem of continued school segregation or resegregation, depending on where you are in this country, was also a problem under President Obama and Race to the Top, of which at the end of his 2 terms admitted had failed to do the work he'd hoped it would do. He is not, was not, and could never be a magical Negro. That is not the critique here. The critique here is that we have moved so far to the right in this country that we need much more intentional focus on moving us minimally back to the center. Richard Nixon in some ways looks like a choir boy in today's era of politics. Well, let me say this. Some call this neoliberalism, as I suggested, market-based solutions to everything, public-private collaboration, which is really more like private-public collaboration, where deference is really only in one direction. I mean, it is not too far off the future that philanthropists will be paying for basic public goods. They already are, from schools to libraries, but they will also be paying for roads and put their name on the side of the highway, not because they are being honored, but because they actually paid for the road. That this, now I realize for some in this room, this feels a little bit like biting the hand that feeds you, in terms of sponsorship and the fact that we do depend upon philanthropy to do good work in this country. But the first choice that we have to make is to be honest about what we really mean when we are thinking about equal opportunity, or, as has been rightly critiqued by Kent Spriggs in this room, diversity and inclusion, or even what we mean when we talk about community policing or education reform. These terms are almost universally accepted by every kind of politician and major figure in this country. What makes these terms so easy to say is because the work is so easy to do. Who can object? I'm sure if we closely examine the talking points of Betsy DeVos and Diane Ravitch, we'd find a generous helping of both terms in their speeches. For example, equal opportunity for all children shows up in just about everybody's speech. The Koch brothers are funding criminal justice reform, and the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, home to the most extreme libertarianism in this country, they are also funding a new professorship at the Harvard Kennedy School. Go figure. So if we are going to level the playing field, if we're going to actually embrace an open society where pluralism is not just a matter of we all get to speak, but in fact we get to speak in recognition that our speech is not equally valued, that some speech counts for more in this country, that we will in fact take seriously what Coates has written about the need to divest of the belief in the power of whiteness. Or, in this way, we will begin to deal with our white problem. Coates writes in the Between the World and Me, families believing themselves to be white enmeshed in a gorgeous dream. I have seen that dream all my life. It is perfect houses with nice lawns. It is Memorial Day cookouts, block associations and driveways. The dream is tree houses and Cub Scouts. The dream smells like peppermint but tastes like strawberry shortcake. For so long, I have wanted to escape into the dream, to fold my country over my head like a blanket. But this has never been an option because the dream rests on our backs, the bedding made from our bodies. To divest of whiteness would mean not just building a new set of policies and a new infrastructure, call it a New Deal. It would require also taking on the old mythologies of our nation's founding and what a liberal democracy has actually meant for most people in this country. That's the work. That's opening the gates on chaos. That's destroying the mythology of the dream and building a new one. If the indigenous of this land do not get to redefine the meaning of Columbus Day, adding them to an existing holiday is as empty a gesture as celebrating Robert E. Lee and Martin Luther King Day in the state of Virginia. In other words, that's the same day, just in case you didn't know it. My critique here is rooted not in moral absolutes or lack of appreciation for compromise and middle road solutions. My critique is rooted in seeing the pattern of this symbolic inclusion playing out over time as an insufficient remedy to the cancer of systemic racism. Welcoming the victims of the past to the table of domination is to do precisely what we have done since the end of the civil rights movement, as wave after wave of black firsts assimilated into institutions built to discredit or to destroy or to erase the community institutions that nurtured those black trailblazers in the first place. James Baldwin called this the price of the ticket for integration. So now we have a lesson that we have learned. We could not have bypassed this lesson, I believe, and therefore, given the powerful mythology of American exceptionalism that has always emphasized opportunity over oppression, America always moving forward, sharecroppers having it better than the slaves, Gen Xers having it better than civil rights heroes and sheroes, and today's millennials, well, having no excuses except until quite recently. Each of these moments has erased oppression on its own terms and has traded on a future that is always aspirational, always a dream of something better. The burden has always been on the dreamers to prove themselves worthy. I say no more. Let me close with an acknowledgement that what Brian Stevenson has done in Montgomery, Alabama with the National Museum and Memorial for Peace and Justice and the Legacy Museum from Slavery to Mass Incarceration gives us an opportunity to get our history right. Their 4,400 documented lynching victims are represented by 800 weathered steel columns, each suspending from the air. Each is labeled by a county where a lynching occurred. And if you're curious, in my own state of Illinois, there were 59 lynchings that happened there, much to the surprise of most Americans. So I want to finish with a quote from someone whose life we know very well, but whose vision of the future ultimately was not the one that we carried forward. And I'll let him speak for himself. We've heard from him a few times, but I will close with a quote by Dr. King. Most of you have read at some point, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, published in 1967. But my guess is, unless you've read it recently, you've not actually appreciated that if, like Lerone Bennett, noting the white problem in America in 1965, like Fred Hampton, focused in Chicago on organizing a multiracial, grassroots radical movement to transform capitalism in this country. You haven't paid much attention to this because you've not asked to pay much attention to it. In fact, you've been told just the opposite, to stop looking back to the past, to only look to the future. So here is Dr. King in chapter 3 of Where Do We Go From Here? He says, "It is time for all of us to tell each other the truth about who and what have brought the Negro to the condition of deprivation against which he struggles today. In human relations, the truth is hard to come by because most groups are deceived about themselves. Rationalization and the incessant search for scapegoats are the psychological cataracts that blind us to our individual and collective sins. To find the origins of the Negro problem, we must turn to the white man's problem." He said, "Every moment of progress was met with a simultaneous step backwards. There has never been, his own words, been a solid, unified, and determined thrust to make justice a reality for Afro-Americans. The white backlash of today is an expression of the same vacillations, the same search for rationalizations, the same lack of commitment that have always characterized white America on the question of race. That gave us black first, that gave us black capitalism, that gave us the gospel of personal responsibility, and it gave us the myth of American exceptionalism." For Dr. King, he finishes with this, "But the day has passed for bland euphemisms. He who lives with untruth lives in spiritual slavery. Freedom is still the bonus we receive for knowing the truth. Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." Thank you.
Can we take a moment for a question or two if you have one? That was so much. I'm still absorbing so many different pieces of it. May I ask one? It might take you back to near the beginning of your talk. I was telling you in the lobby last night, we showed Tell Them We Are Rising about the history of HBCUs. And afterwards, one of the panelists spoke about part of the problem. She was a recent graduate. Part of the problem with HBCUs has been what has happened with some of the graduates. She said they've moved into this liberalism that kind of does not help the HBCUs where they are now. And she said, for example, someone like Oprah, who graduated from an HBCU, she's rich enough to solve the problem in Flint. Why doesn't she? How would you answer that with her, based on what I heard? I think I heard you say before.
No. So I will say that this is, both sort of personal, so I'm going to try to thread a needle here that doesn't call out too much of my own personal experience. But I have watched wealthy black elites bend over backwards to be associated with mainstream institutions above and beyond anything else. And, I'm at Harvard, so I am complicit in this to some degree. But I also ran the Schomburg, and it was much harder for me to get money out of some of those elites than it was for some typical white folks who, were just interested in the work that we do. Partly what I'm suggesting here is not to to simply blame and put down those choices. Partly what I'm suggesting here is that the arc of progress, as those elites understood it, the people like Oprah who made their way from Mississippi to Chicago to racial utopia land, she's in Hawaii, right? Is that it partly what it was every step of progress was a step away from the community from which they'd come. And at some point, even the connection back to those communities. So I have a line in here where I say, you know, part of the ticket was to discredit, to destroy, or erase the very places from which people had come. Philanthropy has become a way, it is one avenue, which models how white elites have done, to then give back. But even that philanthropic spending, Robert Smith out of Texas gave $50 million to Carnegie Hall. Dr. Dre and Jimmy Iovine gave $35 million to USC. I mean, it's pretty remarkable that that level of wealth finds its way in wealthy institutions that are least committed to racial justice and the communities that actually gave birth to the ancestors of those people who have that money now in the first place. Like, I can't figure it out. So partly what I'm trying to do, as I told you, this work is partly work in progress. It is about the white problem, because part of the white problem has been a set of policy choices that incentivize those black elites. It's not to say they don't have agency and could not have made different choices, but black capitalism under Nixon was a policy. It was deliberately designed to create small business opportunities. Affirmative action, which of course is now on life support, grew out of that effort to create a professional class, not to redistribute wealth in this country.
Hello. I had a question about what you mentioned. You mentioned earlier about a mobilized black politic. Right? Do you remember earlier?
Yes, Michael Dawson's quote.
Yeah, without a mobilized black politic. And it seems today that we have a lot of mobilization going on, not only with the NAACP, with the Advancement Project, with Our Revolution, with Indivisible, and it's just hundreds and hundreds of groups. Reverend William Barber just completed the
Poor People's March.
The Poor People's March. 50 years after Dr. King's call for Poor People's March, but it seemed to be overlooked by the media because of the immigration, of the separation of the families. So, you know, the march didn't get any attention. But so my question in terms of mobilizing, there seemed to be mobilizing around the Supreme Court nominee, around the midterm elections, around trying to get people to vote. And so you mentioned, do you see an organized, mobilized black politic? I guess that's what I'm asking, because it seems like there is one, but.
Yes, so great question, and it's a great opportunity to clarify. So partly what I was describing is how we got to where we are, how we got to a sinking cruise ship, which I think we might all agree is represented by the election of Donald Trump in its most visible form. That critique of an anemic black public sphere or black civil society is a critique that precedes that moment. And I think, again, to be fair, certainly my opinion, I don't know that we have empirical evidence for this, but certainly my opinion